Thanks a lot, Dan. Very inspiring. As I outlined before, we will have a brief discussion here between Gesine and Dan now about these ideas, and then you'll be invited also to participate. You can already line up here for the fishbowl or pose your question at slido.com. Gesine, what are your thoughts on what you just heard? I mean, Dan emphasized that we should look more on the supply side. During the last months, you had a very intimate experience with the Social Democratic Party in Germany, touring around the country. What is your impression? Can something be done on that side?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your speech, which was kind of a challenge for me, not only because of the substance, of course, which was very dense, but also because of the speed of your speech. So I had sometimes to really try to follow you. It was hard time sometimes. I'm not quite sure if I always succeeded. I will come back to your question, but I first would like to make some observations. If I got you right, you spoke about the challenges of democracy more or less in the frame of the national state. The national state's democracy, which is, of course, an important base or frame of democracy, but which in the time of economic globalization, for me, would never do it for democratic policy. And I don't say that only for theoretical reasons, but I do think that the national state and the democracies in national states are enormously under pressure because there is a complete asymmetry between what the national state can still reach and the solution the national state can offer for the typical problems of an economy which closes enterprises, etc. So there is a big discrepancy between what the national state can reach in economic globalization and what people, of course, expect from the national states, so because they are not all political scientists. And we can see that the challenges for political solutions are to a large extent transnational. And already in the frame of the European Union, you see how difficult it is for national governments to come together for solutions in order to shape what transnational economic initiatives do, because they have their national sources of power and their national electorates, and this national electorate of Germany, of Great Britain, and of Denmark does not really correspond, or does not have it's not concentrated, it's not focused on questions which would require solidarity between the states. So this is for me the most important challenge, how to redefine institutionally, maybe also concerning the political culture, the frame for democratic politics and policies in times of transnational challenges. The second point is, I think that what you said at the end, that which would be for you the most promising paradigm, namely the social mobilization, is for me also very important, but I do think in another term, because all these movements we have, which seem sometimes to replace parties, but which functionally can never replace parties, in my understanding, because they can mobilize, they can criticize, they can even, maybe to a certain extent, control, but this is more the organized civil society which could control because of their competences, etc. They can never really transfer it into a sustainable politics or policies, and they know that. And that might sometimes allow them to do a very good job, sometimes also allow them to mobilize without any, restraint, because they are not responsible for the transfer into politics. We have seen that in Germany with the so-called climate pact or whatsoever, or how you call it. There is, of course, a huge discrepancy between Fridays for Future and what the political parties in the Grand Coalition have done. Maybe they could have done more, I don't know. It is, if you look very precisely into that, it's really difficult. But of course, Fridays for Future do not feel responsible for transferring and for looking what the people in the Lausitz, in our regions where the coal is finished, would answer to them. Tomorrow I will be going to the Lausitz, that means to this territory where the coal is finished, and we will have a second workshop on that. And there we will really hear things completely different from Fridays for Future, completely different, contrary to Fridays, and with great emotions and a lot of resentment and even a lot of hate and disdain for politicians. So this is a large extent which politicians have to find, and their mobilization, I would say, is absolutely necessary, because in that context, if citizens, people as citizens, do not go on with participation and do not learn politics on that level, which is not always determined by what you described on the national level, which has even more chances to find solutions because people can see and find out by their own experience what happens. On that level, I think there is a possibility to understand what happens in politics, to understand what it means to have very contrary interests, power potentials, capacities, etc., and nevertheless try to find common solutions. So this is, in my view, not just the movements as Fridays for Future, but the mobilization of citizens within their municipality to find common solutions for their development. Because the sustainability goals for sustainable development are not only true for for Africa, they are true even for the states, but also for the European Union. So this is what I would understand by a possibility to relearn what politics means, and then maybe also to come to a more critical, but also to more understanding. And now what have I learned during these conferences? Well, it is difficult to say. I have to say personally, I have learned that on the one hand, I think this strategy to give to the members of the party the power to elect the leaders, I think it was a good and is a good strategy, because the way it was done before, at least in the Social Democratic Party, did not work. And probably when the Merkel era is over, the conservatives will have a hard time for all that too. This is very clear. On the other hand, it showed, in my analysis, that in fact, still within the Social Democratic Party, to say it a little sharply, the apparatus still worked, because it was important what the Young Socialists decided, the organization of the Young Socialists. It was important what the biggest regional group of the Social Democratic Party decided, namely North Rhine-Westphalia. This is a very large amount, and there you have still kind of apparatus decision-making and also loyalty to the apparatus, because organization was the most important power for the social democracy, always. They did it by numbers. They didn't do it by single persons. So, and that means that, again, I would say, the logic did not really come true. Something different happened, and that might be a sign that it takes at least longer to go more to basic decision-making. It might also be that, at least for left-wing parties, the right-wing and conservatives are in a different position. They do not that much rely on numbers and organization. The left-wing always rely on numbers and organization in order to show power. So that, at least for left-wing parties, it's still a long way to come to this kind of fundamental democratization, which they want, which they proclaim, etc. But it is not so easy.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Those were 4 actually really important points. First of all, the importance of the transnational development. So as the nation state, the right frame to address this. The issue of that social mobilization might not be able to replace political parties, the topic of local participation, and the sort of resilience of the apparatus and of the establishment within the Social Democratic Party. Dan, would you like to comment a bit?
Yeah, no, those are good points. I think the point on transnational is a good one. And in particular, the idea that part of the issue is that the mainstream parties can't solve the problems that people think that they should be solving. Yeah. And so I think that's a big part of the story. And what's even worse in a way is when they promise to deliver on certain things or talk about ways. And I actually think this is even a more severe problem for the center right, for purposes of trying to understand the rise of the radical right and so on. That after proclaiming how many hundreds of times over the course of the 1990s that wir sind kein Einwanderungsland, which raises the salience of the issue, and it's politically useful to do that, to then not really deliver on that, in a sense, and shift, and from my own personal view, in good ways to liberalize things, opens up space. And so normally people say, well, the problem is the center-right moved to the center, but I think what people are, moderate, and this left space for the far right. I think this kind of enters into the causal story too late in the game. This is after mainstream politicians play demagogically with issues. I remember actually at the 2005 parliamentary elections, I was on this trip paid for by the DAAD. We were traveling around following the candidates, and we were in Hamburg, and we went to the main square in Hamburg. And Angela Merkel is her first campaign as chancellor candidate, and she was giving the speech, and it was just not a great speech, and it was kind of raining out, and everybody had their backs to her as she was talking because they were looking at a protester who was hanging a banner on a building. And then she said, I can promise you this, we'll never let Turkey into the European Union. And then everybody turned around and got everybody fired up. So, it's true that Turkey didn't join the European Union, but I think the political uses in particular of these issues, and then and the evidence, pretty much clearly shows that, the salience of immigration as an issue, for example, has increased over time. And it's in part a reaction to facts on the ground, but there's some role played by, in particular, I would say, center-right politicians who, say they're going to address this, but in the end don't. And so, again, in the 2018 Bavarian elections, I remember state elections, I remember driving around in the Bavarian countryside and seeing these AfD posters everywhere saying, we will do what the CSU promises. So again, I think this illustrates it. And we find this phenomena, everywhere, whether it's Euroscepticism in Britain, race in the United States. So I think more generally the question of why, politicians' inability to respond to these major challenges, some of which are transnational, some of which aren't, and then to not respond to this in a kind of responsible way is part of the source of why we're in the situation that we're in. So I agree with that. Just in terms of the social mobilization, your point is exactly Bayard Rustin's point, this advisor of Martin Luther King's, in which he really argued that social mobilization without access to politicians and political parties doesn't lead you anywhere. And so this is his big discovery. And so he was very much working in conjunction with democratic politicians to try to get this agenda through. And so the role in this now has become an ongoing perennial debate. what mattered more, the civil rights movement or Lyndon Johnson and passing major civil rights reform? And clearly it's both. And so the idea that there's a role for each of these is totally critical. Can I ask a question?
Please.
So do you think the result of the SPD Vorsitzende, and this is more than just like political curiosity, I think it illustrates a broader point, what if this process would have looked different had there not been direct election?
Yeah, I think that the two remaining candidate partners, both of them have had the main support by different apparatus. I mean, the minister, finance minister, has his apparatus in Hamburg, which is not big, because Hamburg is not a large district of the Social Democratic Party, but he has, of course, a large apparatus support in his ministry, in the whole media stuff, etc. So it was not, in fact, the tour which decided, but the power which is behind, on the one hand, and we do not know yet, because the other one, I would say, was supported by two very important, in numbers, important organizations. one of them, the youth, I had no ideological or program problems with them, not at all. But the president decided he wanted to support them for whatever reasons. And he, of course, with the young organization, he can mobilize. I remember when I was, I think 50 years ago in Schlachtensee in Berlin, there was a small entity of the Social Democratic Party which was close to the students' home. So each time we had a critical decision making at about 10 o'clock in the evening, they made, who wanted a certain decision, they made an interpose and said, just 5 minutes break. And then suddenly the hall was full of students because they just called for them and then everything was done. And this kind of mobilization, which we knew, of course, quite well, I mean, this kind of mobilization also happened now during the conference. And then the biggest, the numbers are one time 80,000, the other 100,000, and you need only each time 20,000 in order to be on that position. So this is, the two of them, what I would say, are the result of previous points. And the point which was important for me was that neither on the conference nor in the media, the question was put, and this is a larger point for me, what would be the challenge for the head of the party? It is not to tell something about the pension funds. It is not to tell something about insurances. It is to tell what is the challenge for the party and how can we find a strategy for that challenge. That would have been the main point. And that leads me to a broader point, because it was interesting that the media were not interested in that at all. Neither was the public in general. They always wanted to ask what would be their future in social problems, social security. But none of the media asked that, as far as I saw that. I have only 4 daily journals and 1 weekly, but nevertheless, one could have read that, because that presupposes also that the media and the journalists would know what is the systematic or systemic function of a party in a parliamentary or even presidential, but parliamentary democracy. This you have to know. And my point is that I have the impression that the important players in the media, but also other important players, have not thought about that, because there is a certain function predetermined by our constitution, which the parties have to fulfill. They were not in our constitution between the 2 world wars, because parties seem to be just representatives of society. Now they are connecting state and society, but what is then the point? And the point would be integration of the diverse interest groups, etc. And if a party is disintegrated, and the 2 so-called Volksparties are both very disintegrated, they don't have common leading ideas which they would really support in common. Maybe they have a kind of common roof, but which doesn't mean anything. So if there is no idea organizing systemic coherence of this into a policy, that doesn't work. And that will happen even to the Greens, who have still the organizing climate issue. But of course, we have now more and more to tackle with social justice and whatsoever, international politics, and then again, the thing will come up. And if the various leaders, and especially the media, do not understand that, do not even know about that, it's a problem.
So if I may summarize this, so basically what you're saying is that sort of supports Dan's idea that the established institutions like political parties, maybe also like the media with their gatekeeping function, has weakened a bit, particularly the Volkspartei and the catch-all parties. So maybe I can integrate now also the first question here from our Slido from the audience. So there's a question on exactly on this hypothesis from Chris Welzer that 8 people have voted up. So there's a lot of demand here. The question is, does the decreasing dependence of politicians on establishment institutions, like the parties or like the media, gatekeeping media, mean actually that there's an increasing dependence on the preference distribution among the citizens? So do they have to take more into account what citizens want.
Yeah.
Qualify that with one
Yeah.
more. So the idea was the establishment institutions, when they were powerful, they could save the political class from a population that might be not so democratic. Now, as the establishment institutions are weaker, they are now fully in the dependence of the population. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the central idea. I mean, this is just a proposal of an idea, and I think there's something to it. I think it gets a little more complicated than that, just that alone, because, of course, the way candidates get selected is not through the preferences of the population as a whole, but the preferences, whoever's selecting the candidates. And so, you know, if you have a distribution of voters, let's say within the SPD or the CDU or within the American Republican Party or the British Tory Party that are way out of the mainstream of general preferences, then you're going to end up with candidates who are going to be further away. So I think Boris Johnson and, you know, the idea that the British Prime Minister is selected by some Conservative Party members, you know, a few thousand or whatever it is that voted is kind of a reflection of this. So in this sense, the breakdown of the establishment institutions doesn't now mean that things have been handed over to the median voter in each country. If that, you know, were that only so, I think, but the problem is actually, and that's why, and so in some sense it looks more democratic, but I think there's also a case to be made that is actually not particularly democratic because of exactly.
What is the median voter? Whom do you think of? I mean, I understand your word, but what does it mean?
Well, I mean, that's a theoretical answer to a theoretical question. I mean, you know, the median voter, you know, in America, it probably varies obviously from country to country. On the left-right spectrum in the United States is presumably the like famous independent voters who probably don't really exist. But I guess the point is that you can end up with candidates as leaders of political parties that don't reflect where most voters are. That's what I mean. So, you know, the fact that Donald Trump became the nominee, you know, how is it that my 10-year-old daughter asks me, you know, over 50% of Americans disapprove of Donald Trump. How is it that he's president? You know, it's because we have this kind of crazy filtration system that ends up with this guy at the top of one party that doesn't really reflect what most voters want. And so I think that when you have the breakdown of these, that's always been the case, but the selection process itself has now changed over time.
I mean, democracy presupposes that citizens are oriented by their reason and by moderation and all these fine things we learn in school. I think the point of social psychology and psychology is underestimated, very much underestimated. I do not think my philosophical idea of people, of mankind, what we call in German Menschenbild, is not pessimistic, is not optimistic neither, is both, so to say, with different potentials. But the potentials are realized by different political institutions, by a different socio-economic situation, etc. And as we have seen in the 20th century, that those who voted for National Socialism were not the poor people. There were those who didn't have a future perspective which was attractive. The socialists had a future ideological perspective, the communists had a future ideological perspective, but part of the middle classes didn't have. They didn't see, they thought they didn't have any future, and they were presupposed to vote for National Socialism. And I mean, Fritz Stern, etc., dealt with that. And so I would say there is sometimes a tendency to say, well, these voters for Trump or for AfD, etc., they are completely crazy, or they are morally bad, etc., etc. My way to try to analyze that is not through these categories, but I try to find out why they are not interested in rationality, in facts, in arguments, and all that. They are not interested. They are not even interested in solutions. And in a way, they are in an extreme despair because they don't believe anymore in any solutions. They do not think there is one. They hate the establishment in a kind of reproach that they don't offer solutions. But in fact, they don't believe anybody. If AfD came to power, they wouldn't believe them neither. And this is what the politics of cultural despair, this is why I choose that word, this despair, how to overcome this despair which is connected to a deep distrust to everybody and to themselves. They don't believe in their power. They don't believe they can implement something. To overcome that vicious circle, I would say, is the challenge in order to bring them back into a democratic play.
And I guess I just would say, I mean, I agree with that entirely. But the one point I would make is that these kinds of voters are not new. I mean, that in some sense, that democracy throughout the 20th century has always had this segment of the population. That number can change, can increase in the face of economic crises and so on. So the question is, why is it that we're in the situation we're in now? We can't explain the abrupt change of the rise of Donald Trump with essentially a constant, which is this segment of the population. And so that's why I am trying to make the case for what's changed is the way that our political institutions operate to deal with dissatisfied and voters who
traditional socioeconomic explanation. I would say what is not doubted anymore that our societies within the developed and between the developed is extremely split, much more split in Germany than 50 years ago. And I remember Tocqueville, who said once in his Democracy,
Schools of Democracy.
Ja, wie heißt denn das Buch nochmal? Verdammt.
Democracy in America.
Yeah, Democracy in America. Yeah. He says at a certain point, well, even if inequality materially has become very small, at a time where equality has grown, even small amounts of inequality count much more psychologically. But even now, we have not only small differences, but huge ones, and everywhere. And everywhere we have the result, split societies. We have that in Poland, we have that in many countries, many states in Europe. I am not so sure if the Scandinavian countries do really fit into that because they have a much more egalitarian tradition, but there maybe Tocqueville counts that even it is smaller, the inequality. And the combination of extremely growing inequalities, of chances, etc., and extremely growing feelings of destroyed self-esteem. The self-esteem for me is more and more the core of the problem, also of empowerment, for learning, for participation, etc. This going together makes out of the problem of people who are in despair much heavier. Because if everywhere this split of society has come, and the so-called middle, if I start from Aristotle, which would be reliable, is not really reliable. By the way, Aristotle also argues psychologically, because the middle are obeying without being untertänig, what is that?
Submissive.
Submissive, and they can give orders without being hochnäsig.
That's difficult.
That is a psychological argument he gives. So this is now a situation around the world which is really dramatic.
Right. Let's maybe bring in another question from the audience here. You talked about divided societies. That relates to this whole problem of inequality, of course, on the one hand, but also of polarization that we talked quite a lot about during the last 2 days. So Tariq Abushadi posed the question here that if we think about it as a trade-off between fighting authoritarians and then also potentially increasing polarization, which is actually the bigger risk for democracy?
That's a bit of a trick question, because I think it's assuming there is a trade-off. I think it is true that if you use hardball tactics in response to authoritarians, so using the tactics that I described in my talk of excluding people from meetings and so on, that this does run the risk of escalating. That is true. But on the other hand, fighting, rolling over and not doing anything is also a risk. So I mean, this is in a sense, these are both risks. So I guess the question though is, which is the bigger risk? They're both risks, I would say. It's sort of we don't have a good choice and a bad choice. We have two bad choices. And the question is, which is the worst choice? And I think this is something that I don't really know the answer to, and I would imagine would be highly context specific in a sense. I mean, I tend to think that in a two-party system, polarization in the American context is much more difficult. So in other words, if one were to use the kind of tactics that are being used for maybe good reasons against the AfD, in a two-party system, if the Democrats did this to the Republicans, this would be incredibly dangerous, because in a two-party system, to essentially treat the only other party in the system as illegitimate, which we're sort of tending towards, in fact, a little bit. I mean, I think the Democrats have largely acted with a lot of self-restraint. In a two-party system, this is much more dangerous. Whereas in a multi-party system, where you have a party that's a kind of relatively smaller party, it's less of a danger doing this. So there continue to be other players with whom parties can cooperate, and so excluding one party. So I guess that's I'm thinking out loud here, but I guess one answer would be it's context specific, the answer to your question, and in a context in which you're a two-party system, I think I think I'm much more worried about increasing polarization. But so I was somebody who was actually very much against impeachment for a very long time in the United States. I mean, so there were some Democrats who, the day that Donald Trump got elected, said, we need to begin impeachment proceedings right now. So that would be a case of risking polarization in order to combat an authoritarian. I don't know why I do that. Combat an authoritarian. I thought that would be a mistake, but I think you reach a certain point where the threat is so severe that you have to be willing to take that risk. And so I think at a point at which somebody is tilting the playing field to such a degree to try to essentially undermine a democracy, at that point, the risk of polarization, that's like a Nebenkost that you can just forget about.
I would just add something, because if we think of overcoming polarization, and we think we can do that by the party system or by parties, I am not very optimistic that that will succeed. When I started studying political science in the 60s, the British majority system was also always preached by more conservative political scientists. They would say, well, this is the good system, because then you have really a decision and you don't need coalitions and you have yes and no, etc., and that stabilizes the system. Now we see the context is counting and not the party system by itself. But I do think that you have to find integration systems, of course also through parties if ever possible, but at least also bottom up. Otherwise, you can't do it. The parties, if you look into these parties, I mean, they are very poor. They are very poor, mentally very often poor. And also institutionally. I mean, I thought always, well, a big party like the Social Democratic Party should have a commission which would really think of a good economic policy. It hasn't, right? I don't think that the Christian Democratic Party has such a commission and would even try to overcome the splits which are as well in the Conservative Party as in the Social Democratic concerning this economic policy. And that also is true for international politics, for military politics, etc. So don't think that these parties who have a tradition and an aura of being big parties would really work. They are working for power games, as this election. There they are working, but not for the content. And therefore, I think we have, again, also, at least at the same time, to do it bottom up. To do it, my point was very often now refugee policy and migration policy, pleading for a model that municipalities should have the right and the finances to decide voluntarily if they want in their own interest to integrate refugees or migrants, and should be financially supported also by the European Union. Now, if that happens, if on the ground people would do that, and if they then would decide on the ground that they would integrate because otherwise the infrastructure or the working power, etc., is not there sufficiently, then you could finally find a common ground if we are really an Einwanderungsland. Because of course, the conservatives needed 40 years for that, but that doesn't mean that their adherents would think that we are an Einwanderungsland. They don't think that yet, right? So what we can do is bottom up understand, well, this has a lot of advantages, and not only for the very, very well educated, which the African taxpayers have paid for their education, and then we absorb the fruits. No, it is also true for those who then come to know through migrants from Somalia or further ever what is happening in Somalia. What is our global connection? It's only bottom up that we can do that integration, I think.
Coming to another question posed from Scholz Enyedi from Hungary, that maybe explains the background of the question a little bit. That is, can the political establishment actually be populist?
Yeah, so this is right. Good question. I mean, this is kind of the risk of doing conceptual innovation, like on the fly in public, as people begin to ask you questions about things. But I think so. I think it's, the political establishment itself changes over time. Who the occupants are of the political establishment changes over time. So one could ask a similar question: is Donald Trump part of the political establishment? In some sense, you would say, well, of course he is. He's president. How could he not be? Or is Viktor Orban part of the political establishment? Of course he is. He's the prime minister. But I guess I don't think necessarily that Donald Trump is actually part of the political establishment. I think Viktor Orban may be. And so the difference has to do with the kind of network of power and the structure of power in a society. And, if Donald Trump gets elected to a second term, I think he then will become part of the establishment. So in other words, does the network of power, it's not about a single individual, it's about a kind of network of power that establishes itself in all domains, from interest groups to media to bureaucracy, military, the halls of parliament and so on, and that this can change over time. But what is clear is that populists, and sort of by definition, I think Fernando had a presentation on this earlier, which I only got to see the tail end of, but the populists, in a sense, the defining feature of populism, which is a term I try not to use, is being anti-political establishment. And so then it's ironic, of course, when they become part of the political establishment, but I think it happens gradually.
But I mean, you see with Donald Trump, who is establishment hoch 3, can always suggest to the public that he is against the establishment. I mean, these kinds of suggestions can work, and that means also that this is, again, not the substance, but the speech. And the point, in my view, is the resentment in that speech. It's not an analytical point of view against establishment. It is creating resentments. And creating resentments unites, because you have a common enemy. This is he might be imaginative whatsoever, but creating this resentment against a common enemy is, I think, one way. And the other point is, of course, which is not at all new, that they suggest that there is a homogeneous people. That is what Trump also does. He always thinks there is a homogeneous people. And you can say that being part of the establishment, and everybody would believe it. And then if you ask a little bit, that's why I wanted to ask you, what is the median voter? I mean, who is this people who votes? And what is the differentiation within that society that they don't want to talk about?
Maybe a connection to this is the next question on direct democracy, because often populists argue that they're actually in favor of direct democracies. I mean, we've done research showing that actually once populists are in power, they don't necessarily enhance the use of instruments of direct democracy, but still they claim that this is something that the people want. So can actually direct democracy instruments like referenda help in rebuilding trust in democratic institutions?
Well, I'm totally against. I have to say that. I'm totally against since 50 years. This is always the same, because we start with a pluralistic society. And direct democracy always, in a way, starts from a kind of homogeneity. Of course, there are levels where you can do direct democracy. But again, direct democracy, even on the municipality level, once you have decided, it is very difficult to change the decision-making. And my understanding and experience of democratic politics is that you have always a kind of try and error. And you do a very good decision, you have really reflected it. And then after 10 years or 15 years, you find the result is different from what you thought it would be. And therefore, but on the level of the municipality, even on the level in Germany, on Länder, I have nothing against. But I would say again, really participation in preparing decision-making but with advisory commissions. Participation in learning who is having which interest, who is having also which power, who's maybe also having the inclination to come to compromises. Is the head of the company the devil himself, or is he both? Is he kind of thinking of his profit, but also trying to overcome certain problems? And so, because if you believe in people or in societies who are totally homogeneous, you can't come to an agreement. It's also for the individual person. If you cannot think that an individual person who would be your foe could also become your friend, and not by material compromises where you get something and the other gets something, but this is not a substantial compromise, then you can't come to a solution. You can't come to social peace. You can't, peace maybe, kind of peace. There's never endless peace. But you can't come to violentless coexistence in a society. And you can't, for me, it's also, by the way, a kind of steering capitalism, because I do not believe, I have never really believed in it, but I've studied enough all these societies and planification systems before 89. I do not believe in this alternative. So if I can't, we see on the other hand that the deregulated transnational capitalism is a machine which seems more and more to absorb politics. This is my view. So if that is the case, we are really lost concerning politics. And then we have to find multi-level and incremental and whatsoever reformist way in order to shape that capitalism, be it on the level of the municipality, be it on the level of the country, be it on the level of the European Union, for instance, concerning the taxes. Now, this is a hard work to find a common tax. And tax normally has been the question of a state. It is not anymore. It is not, because they can all depart and fly the text.
Yeah. What's your idea on direct democracy?
Yeah, well, maybe, I mean, I'm a skeptic. I have kind of a few theoretical reasons. I mean, mostly empirical, kind of coming from the American experience and actually looking at the state level, where it's also disaster, I think, in general. I mean, I come from California, and it's in many ways explains.
Your tax decision was kind
tax
of
decisions
strange.
capped in 1978 that are just, incredibly difficult to undo and are made part of the Constitution and so on. And so I think, I'm a big fan of representative democracy.
All right, but then relating to the next question, do liberal democracies or representative democracies need to change the recruitment system for political candidates and for political competition to adapt to do this?
I do think so. Although I have few ideas on really how to do this. I mean, I think it's clear, like in the what's the shift beginning? Before 1972 in the United States was maybe like the SPD in the past, where essentially these decisions were made in smoke-filled rooms by mostly a group of white men who got together and smoked cigars and drank whiskey and decided on who the candidates were. And it was a highly undemocratic system, but it worked pretty well in keeping demagogues out. The reform, but it's had a very nasty side to it, which, I mean, if you have ever, I encourage you to go on YouTube and look at scenes from the 1968 Democratic Convention, where the guys organizing the convention, the party itself, William Daley sent police in to beat up his own delegates at the convention because he didn't like what they were doing. So there's a nasty side to it. So that's why the system was opened up after 1972. It's a system, though, that continues to be, what's interesting is it looks a lot, after 1972, it looked a lot like your description of the social democratic system. There's this influential book in American politics, The Invisible Primary, which describes that even though there's an introduction of primaries for at least 30 years, it was really the power brokers who continued behind the scenes to set the agenda and choose the candidates. Yeah. And this is the invisible primary. Yeah. And so, that this broke down certainly in the Republican Party in 2016. So I think, we have a kind of relatively broken system in the United States. I think actually the system that the Democratic Party used to have until now was one in which voters chose in primaries, but party leaders, governors, and so on, the so-called superdelegates, which is kind of bad branding, by the way, to call them superdelegates, had an extra vote in the system. And this was a way of kind of balancing the interests of the party and the interests of voters. And I think that tends in the right direction.
It's at least open and transparent.
Open. And I think it's more open. There's an emphasis on recruitment of minorities and women, and so there's an effort to democratize the process, just in terms of pure descriptive representation. But there's also, and there's a pathway for outsiders. I think Barack Obama was an outsider in 2008, relatively speaking, to make their way in through the system. But there is this check of superdelegates, of party leaders who also exert influence. Remarkably, because of the failings of the Republican Party, the Democrats reformed their system and got rid of superdelegates, which I think was a kind of a self-sabotaging reform. So I think some balance of kind of like superdelegates again and voting is the way to go. You know, one idea would be just to have 2-round presidential elections like France does. I mean, I think part of the problem with primaries in the United States, as well as I understand in the case of the Social Democrats just this year, was there's incredibly low voter turnout. And so, you know, they look more democratic, but these systems are not particularly democratic. So ways that it's critical to be able to figure out how to get more people to vote. If you're going to open it up to voters, more people have to vote to make it really democratic.
I mean, we had, of course, that discussion, and 3 or 4 days before the end of that election, we were very afraid that maybe only 30 or 40% would vote. It were finally 53%, and that doesn't sound much. In comparison with the voters within the Green Party, it was not bad. It was more or less the same. So if one knows the figures, it becomes, but nevertheless, with 430,000 members, only about, well, 250,000 voting, this is not really sufficient. I think you are right.
And maybe we can discuss this a bit further together with one of the next question from Yulia. Is every form of citizens' empowerment actually a step towards liberal democracy? Or can a certain form of citizen empowerment also be an indicator for more illiberal tendencies?
I don't know if it's an indicator, but it can pave the pathway to illiberal tendencies. I mean, that's sort of my point. And I guess, you know, it depends on what you mean by citizen empowerment. If you have genuine citizen empowerment, I mean, I'm a fan of democracy. I think the more people who turn out to vote in national elections, the better the outcomes will be. I mean, I believe in the wisdom of the crowd in a way. I think the problem is that what often happens is reforms are undertaken in the name of citizen empowerment, which have the effect of actually not achieving the goals that the advocates of this try to achieve. And so that's, in a sense, what primaries do. That's what I think referenda do, which actually tilt the plane. You know, in a referendum where you have interest groups that are particularly well financed tend to win the game. So I think, you know, this sounds like a bit of a theoretical point, but you know, if you really have genuine citizen empowerment, sure, it's always good. But the problem is what goes under that label is often actually not citizen empowerment.
Yeah, I mean, the problem of counter-intended effects of measures is a very serious one for many things, and that relates, I think, to the next question as well, because, I mean, one of the strategies that it has been suggested for how established political parties could counter the rise of illiberal or populist political parties would be that they adopt policies or measures that these parties actually advocate, right? The so-called accommodation strategy, exactly, thank you. And so the question here is like, what is then the difference between democratic parties and populist parties if the first one use such potentially less democratic but legal ways to actually reduce or contain the effect of populism?
I would never say that every member of an established party is not populist and that every member of a populist party is obligatorily a populist, to say it very clearly. I mean, the rhetoric of our established party has large parts of populism. Sometimes they think that it's only this way they can overcome populism, but there are many gray zones in that field and also gray zones in the conscience of them. Especially you spoke about the migration policy. And there I would again add that it depends on the context. it can integrate all citizens who are voting and putting or sending people into parliament. They are always a good and sustainable part of democracy. And I also, in the large resort, believe in the wisdom of the people. I always have my citation of the Federalist Papers when they speak at, I think, Madison 55, and they say, in the last point, it is the manly spirit of the American people which will save the federal system, etc. But the people can really be in a distress, in a social distress, where the wisdom doesn't really come up. And therefore, we have to be extremely careful that the social base of that democracy does not create a lot of irrationality. That is more or less the reason why I'm a social democrat. I think a democracy, in order to work in the liberal way, I'm totally on the liberal side there, but has to have a social base. Otherwise, the wisdom of the people is in danger.
And another question regarding to what political parties can do, from Christoph Müller-Hofstede, are radical policy platforms in the US and the UK, like Sanders, Warren, Corbyn, part of the problem or part of the solution?
I don't think they're part of it. So by radical, we mean on economic issues to the left. I don't think that's really that's not particularly a problem. It may, in the long run, be a solution in that, I think one of the drivers of polarization is, in fact, economic inequality. But I think there's we have to make sure that we distinguish between people who are economically radical and institutionally conservative. Actually, Senator Sanders is actually against eliminating the filibuster. He's a real institutional conservative. Although he, wants to have, a single-payer economic healthcare system. So, which, by the way, it's hard to imagine how he gets this through the Senate, with the filibuster. But in any case, he's institutionally quite conservative, and on economic policy grounds, to the left. And I think you can have, the two things kind of cross-cut each other. You can have people on the economic right or on policy grounds on the right who are institutionally radical or institutionally conservative. And I think similarly on the left, you can have people who are on the left institutionally conservative or institutionally more radical. And I think that institutional question is the bigger sort of threat. I think, in principle, addressing economic inequality is part of the long-run solution.
And coming to the next question, Gesine, you've interacted a lot with citizens, with party members over the last years. And what do you think? What is actually the best way to react when facing supporters of illiberal parties? And I didn't mean to say that the Social Democratic Party would fit into that category, of course. What is the best way to react when facing supporters of illiberal parties or illiberal ideologies maybe, in your everyday life, like neighbors, colleagues, family members, or the famous taxi driver was already mentioned a couple of times during
There's just
conference.
one of them, apparently.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. I think it depends a little bit, again, on the context. If you are surrounded by idiots of the AfD, you can't do a lot. But if you have to do with supporters, I think it's just to discuss in a very polite way, but to show that you are convinced of your thing, that there is a conviction behind. Because my feeling is that with many of these people, they have experiences with liberal who do not either have a conviction or do not show their conviction, who just what we call 68 Scheißliberal. That means they do this or another one depending on a majority. And I have such a taxi driver, a wonderful taxi driver, in my district. And I have a lot of rides because he's always going from Nikolassee to Tegel Airport or to the railway station. And he is a convinced AfD man coming from a Social Democratic Party. He knows, of course, that I am convinced Social Democrat. And we have a lot of conversation. In a way, he has a lot of sympathy for me. And I have to say I have a personal sympathy for him, only that I think that his opinion is completely crazy. And what is the core of his opinion? This I learned with the 4th, 5th ride. Why are they so focused on Chancellor Merkel? It is not that much the migration point, I have the impression. It is not that much the migration point. But the way she deals with her policy, namely that she simply doesn't discuss and doesn't give reasons for what she does. She is not talking in alternative, but they experience her as a disdaining chancellor. She doesn't even get into a conversation. And I remember such a conversation with a guy, and then he said, I say that in German, sie erkennt niemanden an. And this was for me very illuminating. I have to say it went very far because I went to the Theodor-Heuss-Stiftung, this is a foundation here, and I'm chairing the group which determines issues each year. We have an issue, a theme, and then we choose people who get a prize. And we had then the issue Anerkennung im Streit. This came from this taxi ride, you know, to have a respect when you are counteracting or when you're arguing. And I would say, to a large extent, this would reach the people if you show your respect for the person and clearly say that you don't like his opinion and the reasons why you don't like it and your conviction. This would be, for me, the best way to address him.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, except it's obviously a challenge, and I think it's part of it is going to. I mean, when I wrote this book, How Democracies Die, we were sort of actually our real audience was Republicans. We sort of were hoping, and we kind of were met with a lot of silence. I mean, we did go to Kentucky at one point, to Louisville, and had an interesting meeting. But by and large, I mean, I think what happens is that the polarization takes root to such a degree that people don't. I mean, especially at the elite level, I would say, that people don't want to listen to each other. I think my sense of it is that at the everyday level, it is actually less significant. There are these incredible statistics. 5% of Americans in 1960 said they would be displeased if their child married somebody from the other political party. And according to a political scientist at Stanford in 2015, the number's 50% today. So this is a shocking figure. But I have a feeling, I mean, my impression is that these are exaggerated at some level, that in people's everyday interactions, most people are pretty polite and respectful, and but the real issue is that people just don't have much opportunity to talk to each other.
So let's close with this final question that we have here from Marcelo. Is it enough to learn from Populist, or should the Volksparteien not concentrate, or the catch-all parties not concentrate on their core competencies, including recovering trust through new transparency?
I don't know.
Maybe you want to start?
I don't know what this question is.
I mean, there is a constant, let me say, dispute between Wolfgang Merkel and me when we come together in the Grundwertekommission. He has left, if I see it. Yeah, anyhow, that doesn't matter. He says that this is the end of the Volksparteien, and I say this is not a descriptive question, because, of course, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when we started speaking about Volkspartei, there was a certain quantity of the party, big, they had to have a certain size. This, of course, goes down, and I would say probably the two Christian Democrats and also the Social Democrats will kind of, if I'm optimistic, around 20%, 18%.
Fade away. That's it.
And anyhow, never anymore to have such large support. But the function of the party is not to decide and to say, well, I'm only for these groups, and I offer them now benefits, and then I do hope that they will vote for me. Anyhow, I think this is psychologically completely idiot, because if I were a voter, I would not vote for somebody who would just offer me that, because I would know it's only to get my vote. And next time they will do something else. So there is no logic, no reliability, no sustainability in this kind of strategy. We have, following our constitution, the ideal idea, of course we never come to realize it, but nevertheless, the ideal idea, namely that as a party, we have to organize a program for the whole society, which would follow certain these fundamental values whatsoever, and would, for instance, draw a tax policy which would probably not please those with an income of 3 billion, of course not, but which can be argued for in a kind of Gemeinwohl.
Common good.
The common good, this term comes back, it is very problematic, I know that, but it is not bad that it comes back, because then it's not precise, with all these terms are not precise, but at least you are not allowed anymore, if you talk about Gemeinwohl, to just say, yes, that's my interest, fine, and the market does allow it to me, and that's it. This, for a political community, is destroying democracies, this kind of arguing. And therefore, I would say, the Volkspartei, every party, even the left, or even the Greens, or even the Free Democrats, should be in that sense a Volkspartei, that they have to integrate, that they just give programs for people who own hotels or whatsoever. This is not, I mean, I know what I'm speaking about. This is not in the logic of our parliamentary system.
Right. Great. Do you have any final
Just that,
words?
it's worth pointing out that in the American Constitution, the word political party doesn't appear. And so, we're actually in a much worse situation. I think the German parties remain relatively strong, but I think this is the center part of the story.
All right, great. Thank you so much for your insights here in this final discussion. Maybe we can give a hand to Dan and Gesine. And thanks to all of you, of course, for participating on Slido. I think we got some more food for thought, maybe some answers also, partially, that political parties have some of the answers to the challenges. But for me, this was definitely not the end of the whole thing, even though our conference is coming to an end now, but just the beginning of a continued conversation between researchers and practitioners, between practitioners from different spheres, civil society, government institutions, political parties, to figure out what we can do and what kind of research we need also to help address these challenges that we are facing in Europe these days, beyond doubt. So I think and not only think, I'm convinced we will continue with this. There will be, you can follow our newsletter to see what we'll take away from this. And I also hope that this has inspired many of you to continue research on this topic, to continue working on this topic. Maybe some new collaborations have emerged throughout this conference. And I want to close by thanking those that made this conference possible. First of all, of course, here in the VZB, I first would like to thank Bernhard Wessels, who I approached with this idea about a year and a half ago, and he immediately said, yes, we're on board. So I'm very thankful for this. Has been a great collaboration during this whole time, but also, of course, Wolfgang Merkel and the whole Democracy and Democratization unit, and particularly Gudrun Muhner. I don't know, she's not in the room, I think, right now, but she was amazing in helping to prepare this everywhere. And of course, everybody else in the VZB staff, Guido Kalk, I know, is somewhere here, right? Or most people are probably outside preparing the reception now, so we'll have to thank them later. But really amazing collaboration. I would also like to thank the Open Society Foundation, and particularly Crystal Moorhouse, who is here probably, yes, in the back, yeah. Really for all the inspiration for organizing this event, and of course also the resources to do so. So really much appreciated. And last but not least, I would like to thank the V-Dem team. First of all, Natalia Stefanova, who's hopefully watching us in the live stream right now. She's on maternity leave at the moment, so she started organizing this, but then couldn't come here. Instead, Dominik Hirndorf took over the main organization, and I think he did an amazing job in pulling everything together. Of course, also the other members of the V-Dem team, Vanessa Böse, Lisa Gastaldi, also Sebastian Hellmeier, and also Stefan Lindberg, our director, who also did some work with this. So as I said, this is not the end, but the beginning of a conversation. We can continue now at the reception. We have to finish all the beer. There's a no refund policy, so please help us in achieving that. Yeah, thanks again, and have a great rest of the week.
And we thank the moderator.
Brilliant.